Last month we looked a little bit at Job, this man who was a spiritual man. He was a rich man, and a man who had a burden for his family. But also we learned last time that the Bible teaches that there is an unseen world, a spirit world, the prime plane of God, angels, and Satan and evil spirits. And contrary to belief, which is common in the Western world emphasizes just physical things. They don't see anything spiritual. And the Western world is wrong in that. There is a physical world, but there is also a spiritual world, and the two are not separate, but they are intertwined. And what happens in the spirit world affects what happens in the material world. The two are not separate. Now, in this spirit world, we read in the book of Job that Satan, or the accuser, the devil, gets permission from God to unleash a salvo, an attack of misery and trouble on Job's life, this man of God. And Job reacted to this trouble and trials in his life with sadness. But at the same time, he continued to worship God. And Job freely confessed that God has a right to take away that which he gives us. Job's attitude was that he would love God even if God did not bless him with physical things. And the teaching was basically that Job's faith overcame the troubles in his life because Job's faith, his trust, was in God himself, not in his riches or blessings or his family. He trusted in God. And Job's faith in God was not dependent on God's blessings to him. So therefore, the blessings could be removed, but the faith remains same in the same God. Job did very well. He lost his wealth. He lost his children, but he kept his faith in the Lord. But it's not over. Let me take you back today again in my first point, verses 1 to 6, to the unseen world. Satan went back to God and was found again in the presence of the angels. And there follows a conversation similar to the one in chapter 1. God again points out to Satan, Job is my servant, and he's a good, a righteous man. And there's no one like him in all the earth. And notice what it says in the last half of verse 3 of chapter 2. He still holds fast his integrity, his faithfulness, although you, Satan, move me against him to destroy him. But note the next words, without cause. Without cause. It's very important we remember that. God plainly says that what happened in Job's life, the disasters that happened, were without a cause. There was no reason. And then Satan in verses 4 and 5, just doing what he is, Satan answered and said to the Lord, skin for skin, all that a man has, he'll give for his life. Put forth your hand and touch his bones and his flesh, his body, and he will curse you to your face. That's what Satan says in verses 4 and 5. If you let me touch his health, everything that a man has, he will give for his health, his life. And if Job's health is taken, says the devil, he will curse you to your face, God. You see, Satan does not believe that Job's faith is in God. Satan, and he still believes the same today, Satan believes that every man, every woman has their price, can be bought. He believes there is a way, a means, by which if you afflict a man or a woman enough, they will curse God. There's always a way. And Satan believes another test of Job's faith will prove that Job's faith in God is false. So God says to Satan, he's in your hands, go, but spare his life. So God says to Satan, this far, but no further. It's just permission. And Satan goes out of God's presence, and this man of God, Job, his misery increases. Which brings me to point B, the second salvo of affliction. That is verses 7 and 8. Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord and smote, that means struck, Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown and to the top of his head. And Job took him a potsherd, a broken piece of pottery, to scrape himself with, and he sat down among the ashes of his life. What happened here? Well, the medical diagnosis, boils, leprosy, and the medical diagnosis from the symptoms that we read all over from the rest of Job is mostly a disease called elephantitis. That's the medical diagnosis. Aching bones, chapter 30, verse 17. Peeling skin, Job chapter 30, verse 28 and 30. Wart-like eruptions, Job chapter 7, verse 5. Anorexia, chapter 19, verse 20, losing a lot of weight. Fever, chapter 30, verse 30. Depression, chapter 7, verse 16, and 30, verse 15. And weeping, chapter 16, verse 16. Sleeplessness, chapter 7, verse 4. Nightmares, chapter 7, verse 14. Failing vision, chapter 16, verse 16. Rotting teeth, chapter 19, verse 20. And he looked awful, chapter 2 and verse 12. You know. Satan took his health, and Job was left sitting in the ashes, it says, scraping his skin with a broken piece of pottery. We notice from this, as Christians, we learn from it Satan's tactics against God's people. He slanders them, chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Satan wants to personally attack Christians, God's people. He is persistent and without mercy. There is no mercy in Satan. He also uses Job's friends and his family against him. There's no depths to which Satan will not stoop to attack God's people. And Satan's thinking is, we learn this because we need to know it as Christians, our health and our life is more valuable than God. That's Satan, what he believes. Our possessions, the stuff we own, is more valuable than God. Our family is more valuable than God. And there's always something that a man or woman of God will put before God. There's something else. Now that is the devil's mindset from this book. But that mindset is very popular in the Western world. It's very popular in the north of Ireland. People value their health more than God, their money more than God, and their possessions more than God. I wonder where the people of Northern Ireland got that mindset from. Because it's the devil's mindset. Satan. So again, brothers and sisters, we see that the unseen world affects the material world. Which brings me to my second point, Job's discouragements. You see that in chapter 2 and verse 9. Here's his first discouragement. After he sat down in the ashes, it says in verse 9, then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. St. Augustine, the early church father, says, she played the devil's advocate. John Calvin says, on this occasion she was a tool of Satan. Thomas Aquinas says, Satan spared her in the opening salvo when he lost all his children in order to use his wife against Job, to discourage him. But as human beings, let us not be too hard on Job's wife. Because sure, the Apostle Peter was also used by Satan, wasn't he? And let us also remember that Job's wife, Mrs. Job, is hurting as well because she is the mother of all those children that have died. Derek Thomas, a great preacher from Northern Ireland who now is in America, said, those who have spent hours in an intensive care unit in the hospital, nursing their child through death, can identify with Mrs. Job. End of quote. But the fact is that this lady, Job's wife, is at breaking point, and sadly she urges Job, her husband, to curse God and die. She's meant to be his greatest strength and helper. But at this point, she is his weakness and a hindrance. Now, the other hindrances in Job's life we find from chapter 4 to chapter 31. Quite a big section. More hindrances from his family and his friends. Now, I want to summarize the hindrances of all those chapters in one sentence or two sentences. But I want to give you the theology of those chapters of Job. Now don't worry about the word theology, it's just two Greek words, theologos. Words about God. Theologos. Words about God, that's all theology is. I want to sum up in two sentences Job's other hindrances, because we don't have time to go through all the chapters. But chapter 4 to 31 can be summed up like this. Job's friends come to him. First of all, Job's friends come to him and they talk with him and Job answers them back. Okay, now the conversation is summed up this way. Job, you have brought this disaster upon yourself. Although you seem to be righteous, there must be some secret sin in your life that has caused all of this. That's it. That's the teaching of all those chapters. His friends say to him, Job, you must have brought this upon yourself. God wouldn't do this for nothing. Although you seem to be godly and righteous, there must be a secret sin in your life. And that's why God's punishing you for it. That's basically what they say. And Job denies it. You have sinned and God is punishing you. That's what his friends say. Now, their theology, in a general way, has a lot of truth in it. Because sometimes in the Bible we know that if we as his people sin, he disciplines us, he chastens us. It says in Hebrews, doesn't it? As a father chastens his children, so the Lord chastens those who follow him. God corrects us as a father, as believers, sometimes when we sin. But, so that is taught in the Bible. King David committed great sin, murder and adultery. And God did punish him for it. He had no peace in his family for the rest of his life. Even though he was forgiven, he lived with the consequences. There is chastisement for God's people. But Job's friends, in saying this to Job, are wrong. Because they are applying their theology that God chastens his people or punishes us if we sin. They're applying that to Job. But they have no proof, no evidence that Job has sinned. That's the difference. They're just looking and they're seeing his suffering, and they are assuming he is being punished for sin. And when we do that, that's always wrong. We cannot do it. We don't look at a person and say, oh look, their life is, everything's going wrong for them. They must have sinned. No. That's to be like Job's friends. If someone is suffering, a child of God, we cannot say, oh, that's God punishing them for some sin that we don't know about. We cannot say that. But if we see someone sinning and continuing to sin, then we can say, God will correct them. He will discipline them. But it's only if we see that they have sinned. Then we can say God will discipline them. But Job's friends were not like that. They were just seeing this man's suffering and assuming that God was punishing him for some secret sin that they didn't know about. They were assuming that sin was the cause of Job's misery. But they were wrong, and God proves that in chapter 2, verse 3. That's why I said, remember the end of chapter 2, verse 3, where God says to Satan, you move me against him to destroy him without cause. Without cause. There is no reason, no secret sin why God was punishing Job. There was no cause. The only cause of Job's misery was Satan. It wasn't Job's fault. What he was going through, he had not done anything wrong. Satan had just requested liberty to test the man's faith. So therefore, if we see someone as a child of God suffering, it does not mean that they have done anything wrong or they have sinned. It does not mean that all the time. It could be their faith is just being tested. And by the way, when we see from the book of Job, it destroys the whole idea of the prosperity gospel that is propagated in the Western world. One preacher of the prosperity gospel said, Jesus took our diseases, our pain, our cancer, and our heart attacks so that we as believers may live in perfect health. End of quote. And he goes on and then he says, and if you're not in perfect health, it's because you don't have the faith and you haven't claimed your healing. End of quote. That is nonsense. Nonsense. Rubbish. Because it's not God's will that all Christians should be perfectly healthy. It isn't. And naming it and claiming it's nothing to do with it. Another preacher said, something good is going to happen to you today. Well, I hope it does. That sounds nice. But sometimes something bad happens to us today, doesn't it? And if he thinks every day you can say something good is going to happen to you today, I would say then go and tell it to Job. Huh? Or the Apostle Paul in prison. It's not always true. Sure it's not. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, God's people. And a lack of faith or sin is nothing to do with it. The Apostle Paul was sick. Timothy was sick. Trophimus, Epaphroditus was sick. Did the Apostle Paul not have enough faith to claim his healing? Or was it, as the Bible says, a messenger of Satan was sent to keep him humble, his sickness? Job teaches us that sometimes God's people suffer, and it's nothing to do with secret sins, and it's nothing to do with lack of faith. So that's the unseen world. Secondly, Job's discouragements, his friends and his wife. And thirdly, Job's reaction. Look at verses 9 and 10. What a reaction. His wife said unto him, do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said unto her, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. What? Shall we not receive good at the hand of God? And shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. After he had lost his family, and he lost his wealth, and he lost his health, after all of that, Job says to his wife, sure, it's foolish to think that God's people only receive good and nothing bad ever happens to them. Sure, that's foolish to think that. And it is foolish to think that. What's Job doing when he says this? He is accepting it. Even though he doesn't understand why God's letting this happen, he's accepting it. And what about his faith? Does he curse God? Like Satan said, if you touch his health, he'll curse you to your face. Does he? No, he doesn't. After losing everything, after being tormented by his friends, accused of sinning, Job cries through it all the key verse in the whole of the book of Job, chapter 13, verse 15. He says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even if God lets me die, I'll still trust him. How can that faith, that trust be defeated? It cannot. Job is a tower of trust in the Lord, even when everything is taken away. And how and where did this strong faith come from? You know where? Look at chapter 19, verse 21 to 26. Let me begin to read at verse 21. Listen to this. Have pity upon me, have pity upon me, O ye my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you persecute me as God, and are not satisfied with my flesh? Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed in a book, that they were graven with an iron pen and laid in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand in the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Job's strong faith came from this. He knew, I know that my Redeemer liveth. We have a picture at home hanging on the wall. And my son Samuel, he's now 23. And when he was a little child, his first word was Daddy. And his first sentence ever, because he kept looking at the picture, his first sentence that he ever spoke was, I know that my Redeemer liveth. Well, that was what Job said. Job's strong faith came from this reason. From this is the source. I know that my Redeemer liveth. And what else did he know? And that he shall stand in the latter day upon the earth, his Redeemer. And that though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Job believed, here in the Old Testament, he had a living Redeemer who was coming to earth in the latter day, and that because of that Redeemer, though when he died and his body is eaten by worms, yet he trusted that even in his flesh he will see God. He believed in a Redeemer. He believed that death is not the end. He believed in the resurrection of the body before God through the Redeemer. That's the gospel. That's what Job believed. That's where his faith was. A Redeemer. Redeemer to purchase us, forgive us for our sin, resurrection of the body, and living in the presence of God. That's what he believed. And when people realize that this physical life is not it, and when we die, it is not the end, it is the beginning, then we will be able to suffer physical things with our eyes on eternity and what is to come. The fullness of life through our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. And Job's faith defeated Satan again. You know why I think Job suffered? You know why I think the book of Job was written? I know why. Because God wanted you and I to read this book and to see what real faith can endure and continue to trust. One of the Puritans, Thomas Watson, you maybe heard the name, I don't know, he's a great writer. He lived in the 1600s. He said, when you crush lavender, you find it is full of fragrance. That's the book of Job. The man was crushed, but what a sweet fragrance. Our faith must be in our Lord, not in things. There were a young Christian couple. They lived in my hometown in Lisburn many years ago. I remember it on the news. It was 1981, I think. And their daughter went out on a bicycle one day and never came back. She was 9 years old. Her name was Jennifer. And a few days after she disappeared, this little girl's body was found. Listen to what her father said in his testimony. Giving testimony of his faith, Jennifer's father writes, "I lost my daughter Jennifer. She was 9 years old at the time. She went out on her bicycle one day and didn't come back. And that was the last we saw of her. It was 1981. Until her body was found at Duncan's Dam, that's in Lisburn, a week later. He said, I was comforted to know that even at that young age, she was saved and is now with the Lord." That's crushed level there, isn't it? Still trusting in the Lord through pain. You ever heard of a man called Horatio Spafford? He wrote a hymn that we sing in churches. He was an American in Chicago. He was a lawyer. And the Chicago fire happened, and it was a financial disaster, and he decided to go and visit England by ship. But because something happened in America, he couldn't go on the same ship, so he sent his wife and his 4 daughters on the ship across the Atlantic to England. Now, as that ship sailed across, it collided with another ship and sunk. And over 200 people drowned in the sea, including all 4 of this man's daughters. His wife was rescued and reached England, and there was no telephones, so she sent a telegram. You're limited in words. And the words said, "Saved, alone." The husband got the next ship, and as he was sailing across to England, he had told the captain to tell him where the accident happened in the sea. And the captain brought him up and said, "This is where your daughters were lost." Now this Christian man, you know what he did then? He went and sat down and got a piece of paper and took out a pen, and he penned these words of the hymn. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, or sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, you have taught me to know, it is well with my soul." That's lavender crushed. He wrote something beautiful, trusting in the Lord, even in disaster. Job, why don't you curse God and die? Give up. You've lost everything. Yea, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Will you? Will you? Put your faith in God. Your trust in God, not in his blessings, but in God himself. May the Lord bless you and thank you for your time.